Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Michelle Dixon, and I am the Program and Development Director for the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. And I would like to thank you for joining us for this important discussion about how everyday products can contribute to PFAS exposure. I am very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Katie Borenow, staff scientist at Silent Spring Institute. Katie joined Silent Spring in 2015. She develops personal results reports for participants in biomonitoring studies using the Digital Exposure Report BAT interface. And she studies how these reports can build environmental health literacy and about chemical exposure. She also researches how people's behaviors can influence their exposures to consumer product chemicals. Katie holds a master's from Harvard University and a bachelor's from Yale University. Prior to her graduate work, she worked at Eastern Research Group as an environmental scientist, where she researched worker exposure to silica and diacetyl and assisted with community health investigations into potential exposures to toxic chemicals. Katie, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the introduction, Michelle, and thank you to MBCC for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and to everyone who's tuning in. So the goal of today's webinar is to update you on a recent study from Silent Spring Institute that investigated consumer product sources of PFAS exposure. Some regular listeners of these webinars may be familiar with PFAS chemicals, but I'm going to start out by giving an overview of where PFAS are found, what are some general patterns of exposure in the United States, and why we're concerned about people's exposure to PFAS. Then I'm going to dive into our recent study where we looked at PFAS exposure sources in a cohort of middle-aged women and conducted testing of dental flosses. So this is just the outline that I just went over. So what are PFAS? PFAS are per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Production of these synthetic chemicals began in the 1940s, and today there are over 4,700 PFAS chemicals. PFAS are characterized by strong carbon-fluorine bonds, which makes them very difficult to break down. So they persist in the environment and have been called forever chemicals. Of these 4,700 chemicals, just 2, PFOS and PFOA, have been phased out of production in the United States, and there are numerous replacements. PFAS have both water-resistant and grease-resistant properties, which makes them useful in a wide variety of commercial applications. So I'm going to walk through some of the consumer product sources of PFAS. PFAS may be used in waterproof clothing, like your Gore-Tex raincoat or waterproof hiking boots. You might wear that jacket on a ski trip where PFAS are used in the wax on the bottom of your skis. Heading indoors, PFAS may be used to produce stain-resistant textiles like carpet and furniture, as well as stain-resistant clothing, including work uniforms or doctor scrubs. PFAS are used in grease-resistant food packaging, like microwave popcorn, fast food or bakery wrappers, or paperboard takeout containers, to prevent the containers from getting saturated with grease. They're also found in the Teflon coatings of nonstick pans and cookware. So even if you cook at home, instead of getting takeout, you could still be exposed to PFAS. PFAS are used in personal care products, such as certain flosses that I'll discuss in more detail later, and also many cosmetics like foundation, eye makeup, and even some anti-aging type of creams. And finally, PFAS can be found in some floor waxes and also paints. So as you can see, we encounter PFAS chemicals in many of our everyday products. In addition to products, contaminated drinking water can be a major source of PFAS. It's estimated that up to 110 million Americans may have drinking water that is contaminated by PFAS. The EPA has established a non-enforceable health advisory level for two PFAS chemicals in drinking water, but there is no standard that public water supplies are required to meet. One major source of PFAS in drinking water is certain firefighting foams. These AFFF type foams are used in large volumes at firefighting training facilities that are often found at airports or at military bases. Manufacturing facilities that produce or use PFAS are another important source of contamination, as are waste disposal sites, such as landfills. So contamination of the environment can also lead to contamination of the food supply. So PFAS chemicals are regularly detected in fish and shellfish, and researchers have found that eating fish and shellfish can contribute to higher PFAS exposure. Other unprocessed foods like meat, dairy, or vegetables typically have PFAS detected less frequently and at lower levels compared to fish and shellfish. But the application of biosolids, or fertilizer derived from treated wastewater, is one way that PFAS can enter agricultural production. So given these many different sources of PFAS, it's not surprising that researchers have found detectable levels of these chemicals in nearly all Americans. So I'm going to show you a graph of PFAS levels in adult Americans from 2013 to 2014. These data are from the CDC's National Biomonitoring Survey, which is designed to collect data from a representative sample of all Americans. So the graph shows for each PFAS chemical that they monitored, the range of concentrations that they detected in women, which are shown in red, and men, which are shown in blue. The middle line is the median or typical value, and the colored rectangle is the middle 50% of Americans. So you can see that despite being phased out of productions, Americans still have the highest levels of PFAS and PFOA. You can also see that women typically have lower levels than men. Two biological factors contribute to this pattern. So women eliminate some PFAS from their body during menstruation, and they also transfer some of their body burden of PFAS to their children during pregnancy and breastfeeding. So this graph is similar to the one you just saw, but instead of stratifying the data by gender, I'm showing the distributions by race and ethnicity. So this plot is not adjusted for other factors like income, education, or sex, but researchers have found that when you do account for those types of factors, Mexican Americans typically have the lowest level of PFAS, and you can see them here in red. Non-Hispanic blacks and non-Hispanic whites typically have more similar levels to each other, although non-Hispanic whites have been found to have higher levels of PFOA. And although these most recent data that includes Asian Americans have not been systematically analyzed, it does seem like Asian Americans may have higher levels of some PFAS chemicals, like PFDEA. And these differences could result from differences in patterns of product use by race and ethnicity, or from community level differences in exposure. I just want to also note that some groups can have higher levels of PFAS exposure because they're exposed at work. And so some of these occupations include firefighters because of the use in firefighting foam, ski technicians because of the fluorinated ski wax, and also people who work in facilities that produce PFAS chemicals. So why are we concerned about these chemicals that are found in everyone's bodies? So they're not easily eliminated from our bodies. For PFAS and PFOA, it can take from 3 to 5 years to eliminate half of the amount of the chemical that's currently in your body. For some of the newer replacement PFASs, it can take on the order of weeks to months to eliminate half the amount in your body. So PFAS have also been linked to numerous health effects, including immunotoxicity, which is a reduced response to vaccine, elevated cholesterol, thyroid disease, certain cancers, including kidney and testicular cancer, altered mammary gland development, and decreased fertility. So now I'm going to shift to talking about the study that we published this January in the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology. The primary objective of the study was to determine the contribution of self-reported consumer product use to PFAS exposure. And to try to answer this question, we collaborated with the Child Health and Development Studies, or CHDS. CHDS is a multi-generational study of environment and disease that began enrolling pregnant women in Oakland, California during the 1960s. Since then, the researchers have been following the health of the mothers, their children, and now their grandchildren. This cohort study has been extremely powerful and has shown, for example, that the mother's exposure to DDT that their daughters experienced in utero was shown to increase their daughter's risk for developing breast cancer later in life. So the current study of PFAS exposure is focused on 178 of the adult daughters in the second generation, so where that star is on the timeline. So these women had blood samples collected from 2010 to 2013 as part of their participation in CHDS, and the samples were tested for environmental chemicals, including PFAS. Subsequently, we had the opportunity to interview the women about behaviors related to PFAS exposure as part of a study where we returned their personal chemical results. So the combination of these two types of data, having the levels of PFAS in blood and their self-reported product use, allowed us to compare how their behaviors related to the levels of the PFAS in their bodies. So you can see from this study design that one limitation is that we collected the behavior data about PFAS product use several years after the blood samples. We don't consider this a really severe limitation because of the long half-lives of PFAS chemicals. So PFAS levels in blood represent long-term behavioral averages. And we expect people's habits to be fairly consistent over time, especially at the level of detail that we considered in this study. So our participants were middle-aged women, about half African American and half non-Hispanic white. They lived mostly in California, and about half of the participants had at least a bachelor's degree. So the sources of PFAS that we asked about in the study included eating food prepared with nonstick cookware, eating microwave popcorn, flossing with Oral-B Glide dental floss, eating prepared food from coated cardboard containers, eating seafood, owning stain-resistant carpet and furniture. And so these behaviors were all collected by interview. And then we also considered whether the participant was living in a city served by a PFAS-contaminated water supply. And so we assessed that using data from EPA's third unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. So from 2013 to 2015, EPA required all large public water supplies and some small water supplies to test for 6 PFAS chemicals. Because of the high detection limits in these data, we considered a participant to have contaminated drinking water if she lived in a city served by a public water supply that had at least one detectable PFAS. So now I'm going to show you the levels of PFAS that we found in our participants. Of the 4,700 PFAS chemicals, the women in the study were tested for 11. Our analysis focused on 6 chemicals, and I'm going to draw your attention to the 2 chemicals in the orange box. So on the left-hand side of the graph, we have African American and non-Hispanic white women in CHDS, which is our study. And on the right side of the graph, we have similar women from the CDC's National Biomonitoring Study, which I talked about earlier. So you can see that our study participants have very similar levels as those seen nationally, which helps us feel confident that these women are typical in their PFAS exposure. You can also see that for these 2 chemicals, non-Hispanic white women had higher levels than the African American women, which is similar to what has been observed before in the national biomonitoring data. To uncover the links between behavior and PFAS exposure, we used a statistical technique called multiple regression. So the model, statistical model that we built can use the data on the 6 PFAS-related behaviors that we asked about, the data on whether they lived in a city with a PFAS-contaminated water supply, as well as race and education. So this type of model is designed to isolate the specific contribution of each behavior individually on PFAS exposure. So using this model, we found several associations between behavior and PFAS. So I'm just going to go through each of these one by one. So living in a city served by a PFAS-contaminated drinking water supply was associated with higher levels of 3 PFAS chemicals. We were still able to observe this association, even though there were only a few people in our study who lived in these affected areas. And this just, I think, goes to support just how big of an issue PFAS-contaminated water is for impacted communities. Next, we found an association with owning stain-resistant carpet and furniture and higher levels of 2 chemicals. So previous research has found associations between carpeting and furniture and sulfonic PFAS, so like slightly different PFAS chemicals. But the 2 that we found associations with have been detected before in treated carpet and furniture. Next, we found an association with consuming high levels of prepared food in cardboard packaging and 4 PFAS chemicals. So we observed this association in African American women only in our study. So one potential issue is that we asked in our study about whether the women ate food from coated cardboard containers. And when we designed the study, we predicted that that would be the most important source of PFAS from food packaging. Since then, our research at Silent Spring has shown that actually paper wrappers are more likely to contain PFAS than coated cardboard containers. And like one limitation of this type of research is that when you're conducting the study, you need to be able to ask the participants the right questions and already have an idea about what the sources are. But based on the specific participants' answers to the specific questions that we used to create this coded cardboard variable, one hypothesis that we have is that the coded cardboard is a better proxy of exposure to PFAS from paper wrappers for African Americans in our study compared to non-Hispanic whites. Finally, we observed an association between flossing with Oral-B Glide and higher levels of one PFAS chemical, PFHXS. So Oral-B Glide has been suspected to be made from PTFE, which is a large PFAS polymer that's also known by the brand name of Teflon. Oral-B Glide was developed by the Gore Company, which is the same company that created the Gore-Tex waterproof fabric and is known for their fluoropolymer technologies. In addition, the Oral-B website describes PTFE floss as one of 4 types of dental floss. So we wanted to confirm that Oral-B Glide was a likely source of PFAS and also assess the availability of other PTFE-based flosses. So in the second part of the study, we tested 18 floss products to try and gain a better understanding of the availability of PTFE-based flosses. So we used a rapid and low-cost test method called PIGE. PIGE tests for total fluorine as an indicator of PFAS, and it works by bombarding an object. So in this picture here, it's actually food packaging it's shooting a beam of ions at the food packaging, and this causes some elements, including fluorine, to emit gamma rays. And by measuring the pattern of gamma rays that's specific to fluorine, we can learn how much fluorine the object contains. So PIGE has previously been used to test for PFAS in food packaging and textiles, and we used it in this study to test dental floss. So these are the results that we found in our floss testing. 6 of the 18 flosses tested positive for fluorine, and even though this wasn't a fully quantitative test, the levels of fluorine that we detected in these flosses are comparable to those that are observed in commercial Teflon tape. So we think it's unlikely that our results could be explained by a fluoride coating alone on the flosses, if that was something that was added for dental health. All 3 of the Glide products in the orange box tested positive for fluorine, as did 2 of the 3 flosses that had advertised on the product compared to Oral-B Glide. And the final floss that tested positive at the top, the Colgate Total, is actually advertised online as a single-strand Teflon fiber. On a more positive note, 12 of the flosses did not test positive for fluorine, and so it does demonstrate that there are many PFAS-free alternatives available. So after the study was published, the association between flossing with Oral-B Glide and higher levels of the PFAS gathered substantial media attention. And this caused Oral-B to respond with the statement that we have confirmed none of the substances in the report are used in our dental floss. And so a few things that I would note is that our study tested for 11 of the 4,700 PFAS chemicals. And they did not actually deny that their floss was PTFE based. So like we did not test for PTFE in the study, which is a large polymer, but we did test for the smaller PFAS chemicals. And a major barrier to understanding why we saw the specific association with PFHXS is the lack of transparency surrounding the production practices and formulations that Oral-B is using. But one possibility is that the specific PFAS chemicals, like PFHXS, might occur as impurities in the raw materials or be created as byproducts during manufacturing. So just to summarize, our study findings reaffirm that contaminated water is an important exposure source. It strengthens the evidence for exposure to PFAS from consumer products. And the findings, I believe, also support taking individual action to avoid PFAS in products. So I'll just leave you with a few tips for trying to avoid PFAS. If you are looking for dental floss and you can't take your copy of the study with you, we suggest choosing nylon or silk dental floss that is either uncoated or coated in a natural wax. To avoid PFAS in food packaging, it's great just to eat more fresh foods. Stay away from the microwave popcorn. You can always get an air popper or, take the old school route and pop it over your stove. We suggest choosing stainless steel, enameled, or cast iron cookware as opposed to non-stick cookware that may have a Teflon coating. One piece of advice is that when you're looking at cookware, some brands will actually advertise as PFOA and or PFAS free. But manufacturers may be using a different PFAS substitute. And so that's just something to be aware of. If and when you're redecorating your home, I suggest looking for carpet and furniture that are not treated for stain resistance. But of course, it's a lot more difficult and expensive to replace those types of furnishings than some of the other, getting a new pack of dental floss. When you're buying cosmetics or other beauty products, you can look at the ingredients to see if they contain PTFE or other ingredients that contain perfluoro. And finally, because manufacturers in the US aren't required in many cases to disclose the chemicals that they use, it can be challenging to know for sure if there are PFAS being used. And so you can always, as consumers, call the manufacturers and really try to ask or demand for more transparency about the chemicals that are used in their products. So thank you. I want to acknowledge all of the authors on this study, which include Julia Brody and Laurel Shader here at Silent Spring Institute, Graham Peasley at the University of Notre Dame, who ran all of the dental floss testing, and Barbara Cohn and Laurie Havis of the Child Health and Development Studies. And I think now I can take questions.
Great, Katie, thank you. Yes, I do invite any of our listeners to feel free to type in a question. I've got one here. someone has asked, what is the correlation between PFAS exposure and certain consumer products? In other words, are exposures higher from some of the products that you listed more so than others?
So in our study, the I'll just go back here. But basically, living in a city served by a contaminated drinking water supply was associated with 84 to 104% higher levels of those three chemicals compared to people who did not have a contaminated drinking water supply. And so that is, you can see here, compared to the 19% higher with the stain-resistant carpet and furniture, and the 25% higher for floss, but is more comparable to this 90 to 124% higher that we see for eating high levels of prepared food from cardboard packaging. So hopefully that maybe addresses your question, that yes, for some of these behaviors, the effects that we see are greater than for others.
Okay, great. Yes, I'm getting a response from the person who asked the question. That helps. Thank you. I've got another question from someone who wants to know, you had referenced that manufacturers in the United States are not bound by PFAS restrictions. So it begs the question, is that different for manufacturers in Europe and other parts of the world?
That's a great question. And I am actually not sure what the state of the regulation is on PFAS in Europe, but for other types of chemicals, they certainly do sometimes have more restrictive chemical uses than in the US. But I can't say for sure about PFAS.
Okay. Someone has asked, could you give examples of paper food wrappers? Do you have any specifics? Do you know if there are any paper food wrappers that don't run the risk of a PFAS exposure?
So yes, Laurel Shader did a study of fast food packaging and testing like a wide range of fast food packaging for PFAS chemicals. And what she found is that I want to say about 50% of the wrappers contained PFAS. And so certainly not all of paper wrappers contain PFAS. And, you know, if you're just like wax paper, for example, or parchment paper, I think should not contain PFAS chemicals. And I know that after Laurel's fast food packaging paper came out, that manufacturers were interested in learning more about how to shift their products away from those that contain PFAS.
Okay, and I have got a couple of questions around the water contamination. Given that that is the biggest source based on your research, how does someone go about finding out if their water is in fact contaminated?
Yep. So I recommend either calling your water supplier or looking at the water quality reports that they post online to see if they have done testing of the water supply for PFAS. You can also check the EWG's tap water database to see if your water supply has been tested. If you are on a private well, then you can talk to your town's health agent to learn if the town has done any testing, or if they know of possible sources of contamination that might be affecting your well. It is very expensive to test your water yourself for PFAS chemicals. Right now, for residents on Cape Cod, Silent Spring is part of a study that is doing PFAS testing of private wells on the Cape. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, you can get in touch with me or look up the STEEP study online.
And as a follow-up, a couple of people have asked where they can get information about the best filters to use, and are there filters that will actually remove PFAS from the water supply that can be used in a home setting?
So solid carbon block filters will remove long-chain PFAS, like PFOA and PFAS, but it may not necessarily remove some of the newer, shorter-chain PFAS replacements. But carbon block filters are readily available for home use. Reverse osmosis does seem to remove the shorter chain chemicals, but it does have the disadvantage of creating a lot of wastewater. So for every gallon of clean water you produce, it requires 3 to 4 gallons of the original water.
Katie, I have someone who wanted to go back to the coated paper, coated cardboard question from a slightly different angle. What about paper plates? She says that they use a lot of coated paper plates, obviously for grease resistance, and want to know, is there health risk associated with that form of coated cardboard as well?
So I don't have any specific data on paper plates, but it does seem plausible that PFAS are used in that way. And so, and like, I know PFAS are used on containers that you might get at like a hot food bar at the grocery store. So that's sort of a similar use. Yeah, I don't have a lot of advice except to maybe try to find some plates that don't seem like they're coated.
Mm. And on to that, is there any research tied to styrofoam containers and styrofoam plates as an alternative to paper plates?
So I'm not aware of any research showing that any sort of coatings are used on styrofoam, but styrofoam has other environmental concerns in that it also doesn't biodegrade and can't be recycled.
Exactly. Right. Okay, thank you. So if given Oral-B's response, has there been any pushback in terms of the research? The research that you presented did create quite a buzz in the media, and they gave a very short and almost dismissive response. Has there been any more follow-up?
So there hasn't been a lot of follow-up from that. After the initial wave of media coverage, there wasn't, I guess, a lot of opportunity for them to have to keep responding. But one thing that so about a week after this health.com piece came out, there was another news article that, they also emailed, got a statement from Oral-B, and it said almost the same thing, except it said, we have confirmed none of the substances in the report are intentionally used in our dental floss. So they added this word intentionally. And I think that just goes to kind of supports the idea that some of these chemicals might be introduced as impurities or be produced as byproducts from the manufacturing process where they are using other PFAS chemicals.
Okay, thank you. And on the question of flame retardants, are you seeing in your research an acknowledgement by manufacturers, a move away from the retardants in furnishings?
So within the past few years, California changed their flame retardant standard such that manufacturers can produce furniture that doesn't contain flame retardants, and it's now labeled as such, like yes, it contains flame retardants, or no, it doesn't. But I think it's a lot easier to tell if your furniture contains flame retardants than it is to know if you're getting a stain-resistant furniture, whether it's been treated with PFAS chemicals, because there is no sort of legal standard for that.
Okay. And we have time for another question or two if there are still a couple left. Please feel free to type them in. Okay. Katie, I want to thank you for sharing this information with us today. On behalf of Cheryl Osimo, our executive director, and on our board of directors, thank you for providing this additional information. There's always a lot to learn about PFAS. And I want to thank our many listeners for joining us. I invite you all to visit the MBCC website for additional information on PFAS. There are a number of items on the drop-down menu there that you can take. There's an addition to a fact sheet where you can gain some additional information. And always feel free to send us emails at info@mbcc.org. If you think of additional questions after this webinar, we'd be happy to get them to Katie and have them addressed. And for those interested in the recording of today's webinar, that will be made available later this afternoon on our website at www.mbcc.org. Katie, thank you again.
Thank you, Michelle.
And to our listeners, have a good afternoon.